My grandpa hid a 1969 Camaro behind a fake wall. We opened it after he passed. When 22-year-old Jake Morrison inherits his grandfather's modest garage in Detroit, he expects to find nothing more than old tools and spare parts. But a cryptic note leads him to discover something extraordinary hidden behind a fake wall. A pristine 1969 Camaro SS that holds the key to understanding his grandfather's mysterious past. As Jake uncovers the truth about why his grandfather concealed this automotive treasure for over 50 years, he embarks on an emotional journey that will change his understanding of family, sacrifice, and the true meaning of legacy. Set against the backdrop of Detroit's automotive heritage, this is a story about healing old wounds, discovering hidden truths, and learning that sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in dollars, but in the stories that connect us to those who came before. If these stories moved you, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to Rust and Memory, because some engines don't just start cars, they start memories. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. The morning mist clung to the cracked asphalt of Detroit's east side as Jake Morrison pulled his beat-up Honda Civic into the gravel driveway of his late grandfather's garage. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and motor oil, a combination that had defined every childhood visit to this place. Now, 3 weeks after the funeral, Jake was here for the final time, tasked with cleaning out the building before the estate sale. The garage stood like a relic from another era, its red brick walls weathered by decades of Michigan winters. A hand-painted sign reading "Morrison's Auto Repair" hung crooked above the bay doors, the letters faded but still legible. Jake had always loved this place, with its smell of grease and gasoline, the sound of pneumatic tools, and his grandfather's patient voice explaining how engines worked. "You're early," came a voice from behind him. Jake turned to see his Aunt Carol approaching, a cardboard box balanced in her arms and a tired expression on her face. At 55, she bore a strong resemblance to their grandfather, the same steel-gray eyes and determined jawline that had made Earl Morrison both respected and slightly feared in the neighborhood. "Couldn't sleep," Jake admitted, fishing the keys from his pocket. "Figured I might as well get started." Carol set her box down and studied her nephew's face. "You know, honey, you don't have to do this alone. I can help you go through his things." "I know, Aunt Carol, but I need to do this myself. It feels important." She nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. "Your grandfather would have liked that. He always said you were the only one who really got what this place meant to him." She paused, then reached into her purse. "I almost forgot. The lawyer found this in Grandpa's safety deposit box. It's addressed to you." Jake took the envelope, noting his name written in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, still steady despite his 83 years. The paper felt thick and expensive, not like the usual notepads his grandfather used for repair estimates. "What do you think it is?" Jake asked. "Only one way to find out," Carol replied with a gentle smile. "I'll leave you to it. Call me if you need anything, okay?" After she drove away, Jake stood alone in the early morning quiet, turning the envelope over in his hands. His grandfather had been a man of few words, practical and straightforward. A formal letter seemed out of character. Taking a deep breath, Jake tore open the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Jake, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably standing in front of the garage, wondering why an old man kept so many secrets. The truth is, some stories are too painful to tell while you're living them, but too important to take to the grave. There's something in the garage I need you to find. Look for the wall behind the old workbench, the one with the calendar from 1987. It's not what it seems. Press on the wood paneling about shoulder height near the corner. You'll know when you find the right spot. What's behind that wall belongs to you now, but more than that, it's a piece of our family's story that I should have shared years ago. I'm sorry I waited so long to trust you with the truth. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. You'll understand everything once you see what's there. Love, Grandpa Earl P.S. Don't let your aunt see this until you've had a chance to process what you find. She's been through enough. Jake read the letter twice, his heart racing. His grandfather had always been mysterious about certain things, why he'd never remarried after Jake's grandmother died, why he'd kept the garage running long past retirement age, why certain conversations always seemed to make him distant and sad. Now it seemed Jake was about to get some answers. He unlocked the garage and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar cocktail of motor oil, metal shavings, and old leather. The space looked exactly as it had during his last visit 6 months ago, tools organized with military precision, parts bins labeled in his grandfather's careful handwriting, and the ancient workbench that had been the centerpiece of the shop for as long as Jake could remember. The workbench sat against the back wall, just as the letter described. Above it hung a faded 1987 calendar featuring a classic Mustang, its pages never turned past March. Jake had always assumed his grandfather kept it there out of nostalgia, but now he wondered if it marked something more significant. Running his hands along the wood paneling behind the bench, Jake felt for any irregularities. The wall seemed solid at first, but as he worked his way toward the corner, his fingers found a section that felt different, slightly raised, as if the wood wasn't quite flush with the rest of the wall. He pressed gently, and his heart jumped as the panel gave way with a soft click. A portion of the wall swung inward like a hidden door, revealing a dark space beyond. Jake fumbled for his phone's flashlight, his hands trembling with anticipation. The beam of light revealed something that made him gasp audibly. Chrome bumpers gleamed in the darkness, and he could make out the distinctive curve of a muscle car's hood. As his eyes adjusted, Jake realized he was looking at a car, a beautiful, pristine car that had been hidden behind this fake wall for God knew how long. His grandfather's desk stood nearby, and Jake remembered the letter's instructions about the key. He pulled out the bottom drawer and felt underneath until his fingers found a small metal object taped to the wood. The key was old and worn, with a distinctive bow that Jake recognized as belonging to a classic car. With growing excitement and bewilderment, Jake began clearing away the workbench and other obstacles that blocked the hidden opening. As he worked, questions flooded his mind. How long had this car been here? Why had his grandfather hidden it? And why had he never mentioned it to anyone in the family? As Jake finally cleared enough space to enter the hidden room, he stepped into what felt like a time capsule. The air was dry and still, with a faint smell of preservation wax and old leather. His phone's light revealed more details of the car, sleek lines, a black racing stripe down the hood, and what appeared to be SS badges on the grille. "Jesus," Jake whispered, running the light along the car's length. "It's a '69 Camaro SS." The car was in immaculate condition, as if it had rolled off the showroom floor yesterday. The hugger orange paint gleamed without a single scratch, the chrome was spotless, and through the windows Jake could see a pristine black interior with bucket seats and a center console. He walked around the car slowly, taking in every detail. This wasn't just any Camaro, this was a high-performance SS model, probably worth a fortune. But more importantly, it represented a mystery that had been hidden in his family for decades. Jake tried the key in the driver's door, and it turned smoothly. As he opened the door, the overhead light illuminated the interior, revealing something that made his breath catch. Sitting on the passenger seat was another envelope, this one yellowed with age and addressed simply to "My son." But Jake's father had died when Jake was only 5, and his grandfather had never mentioned having any other children. Confused and curious, Jake picked up the envelope and noticed it wasn't sealed. Inside, he found a photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed a young man in his 20s wearing a military uniform and standing next to what looked like the same Camaro. The resemblance to Jake was striking. The same dark hair, the same strong jawline, the same green eyes. On the back of the photo, someone had written Tommy 1969 in faded ink. Jake's mind reeled. Tommy. He'd never heard his grandfather mention anyone named Tommy. His father's name had been Robert, and as far as Jake knew, he'd been Earl Morrison's only child. The paper contained a brief note in his grandfather's younger handwriting. Tommy, I'm putting the car away until you come home. I know you'll want to drive her again someday. The keys will be waiting. Dad Jake sank into the driver's seat, trying to process what he'd discovered. Who was Tommy? Why did he look so much like Jake? And what had happened to him that made his grandfather hide the car away, apparently waiting for a return that never came? The Camaro's interior was as perfect as its exterior. The gauges gleamed, the steering wheel showed no wear, and even the radio appeared to be in working order. Jake noticed the odometer read only 847 miles, suggesting the car had barely been driven before being hidden away. As he sat in the driver's seat, Jake felt an odd connection to this mysterious car and the even more mysterious Tommy. The late morning sun was beginning to stream through the garage's dirty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Jake realized he'd been in the hidden room for over an hour, completely absorbed in his discovery. His phone buzzed with a text from his Aunt Carol. "How's it going? Found anything interesting?" Jake stared at the message, unsure how to respond. His grandfather's letter had specifically asked him not to tell Carol about whatever he found until he'd had time to process it. But this discovery was bigger than anything he could have imagined. He typed back, "Still going through things, lots of old parts and tools, will call you later." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Jake needed time to think, to figure out who Tommy was, and why his grandfather had kept this secret for so long. The car represented more than just a hidden treasure. It was a mystery that reached back into his family's past, touching on secrets that someone had been desperate to keep. As Jake climbed out of the Camaro and prepared to close up the hidden room, he made a decision. He was going to find out who Tommy was, what had happened to him, and why his grandfather had spent decades waiting for someone who never came home. The car would stay hidden for now, but Jake would return tomorrow to begin unraveling the mystery that had been waiting behind the fake wall. He carefully repositioned the workbench and made sure the hidden panel was secure. To anyone else, the garage would look exactly as it always had. A cluttered but organized workspace where Earl Morrison had spent his final years fixing other people's cars and keeping his own secrets. But Jake knew the truth now. Behind that innocent-looking wall sat a piece of automotive history and family mystery that would change everything he thought he knew about his grandfather and his family's past. As he locked up the garage and headed home, Jake's mind was already racing with plans for tomorrow's investigation. The first step would be researching Tommy Morrison, a name that didn't appear in any family stories Jake had ever heard, but whose face looked back at him from a 50-year-old photograph with eyes that could have been his own. Chapter 2. Uncovering the Past. Jake spent the night tossing and turning, his mind racing with questions about Tommy and the hidden Camaro. By sunrise, he was already dressed and heading back to the garage, armed with his laptop, a thermos of coffee, and a determination to uncover the truth about his family's secret. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant hum of Detroit waking up. As Jake unlocked the garage, he felt like he was entering a different world, one where the past and present collided in ways he was only beginning to understand. He immediately went to his grandfather's office area, a small space partitioned off from the main shop floor. The desk was old and scarred, its drawers stuffed with decades of receipts, parts catalogues, and customer records. If there were clues about Tommy anywhere, they would be here. Jake started with the most obvious places: address books, photo albums, and filing cabinets. His grandfather had been methodical about record keeping for the business, but his personal files were surprisingly sparse. It was as if Earl Morrison had deliberately kept his private life separate from everything else. After 2 hours of searching, Jake was about to give up when he noticed something odd about one of the filing cabinet drawers. It seemed shorter than the others, as if there were a false back. Pulling out all the files, Jake felt around the rear of the drawer and found a loose panel. Behind it was a manila envelope, thick with contents and labeled simply TM. With trembling hands, Jake opened the envelope and found what appeared to be a life's worth of memories. There were dozens of photographs, letters, official documents, and newspaper clippings. The photos showed Tommy at various ages, as a child playing in what looked like the same garage, as a teenager working on cars, and as a young man in military uniform. One letter, dated March 1969, was from Tommy to his father. "Dad, I know you don't agree with what I'm doing, but I have to go. This war is tearing the country apart, and I can't sit here working on cars while other guys my age are fighting and dying in Vietnam. I've enlisted in the Army, and I leave for basic training next week. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. You always said the garage would be mine someday, and maybe it still will be. But right now, I need to do something that matters. Take care of the Camaro for me. I'll be back to drive her when this is all over. Love, Tommy." Jake's hands shook as he read the letter. Tommy was his grandfather's son, but not the son Jake had known about. How was that possible? More pieces of the puzzle emerged as Jake continued through the envelope's contents. A birth certificate showed Thomas Earl Morrison, born in 1947. Military records indicated that Private Thomas Morrison had been deployed to Vietnam in late 1969. And then Jake found the document that explained everything, a telegram from the U.S. Army dated December 15, 1969. "Mr. Earl Morrison, stop regret to inform you that your son, Private Thomas E. Morrison, was killed in action, 30th December 1969. Stop body not recoverable due to circumstances of engagement. Stop deepest sympathy, stop." Jake sank into his grandfather's old chair, the weight of the discovery hitting him like a physical blow. Tommy wasn't coming home because Tommy was dead, killed in Vietnam just months after leaving for the war. His grandfather had hidden the Camaro for over 50 years, waiting for a son who would never return. But the mystery deepened as Jake found more documents. Marriage certificates showed that Earl Morrison had been married twice, first to a woman named Helen Kowalski in 1946, then to Jake's grandmother Mary Chen in 1973. Helen had died in 1971, according to her death certificate, just 2 years after Tommy's death. Jake realized with growing amazement that he'd had an uncle he'd never known about, and his grandfather had lost both a son and his first wife within a few years of each other. The pain must have been unbearable. A handwritten journal, apparently started after Tommy's death, provided more insight into his grandfather's state of mind. December 20th, 1969. "The Army says Tommy's body can't be recovered. Something about the position being overrun. How do I bury a son when there's nothing to bury? Helen won't stop crying. She blames me for not stopping him from enlisting. Maybe she's right." December 25th, 1969. "Couldn't bring myself to start the Camaro today. It was supposed to be Tommy's Christmas present when he got back. Now it just sits there, perfect and waiting for someone who's never coming home." January 15th, 1970. "Put the car in the back room today, sealed it up. Helen says I'm being morbid, but I can't bear to look at it. It's too much like having hope for something that can't happen." The entries continued sporadically for several years, chronicling Earl's grief and his gradual decision to hide any trace of Tommy's existence. Jake began to understand why he'd never heard Tommy's name. His grandfather had been trying to protect himself and others from the pain of the loss. A final entry, dated much later, caught Jake's attention. March 15th, 1987. Jake came to the shop today with Robert. He's only 8, but he loves cars the same way Tommy did. Same questions, same excitement about engines. It hurts to watch him, but it also gives me hope. Maybe someday I'll be able to tell him about his uncle. Maybe someday the pain won't be so sharp. For now, the car stays hidden. But maybe it's not waiting for Tommy anymore. Maybe it's waiting for Jake. Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes as he read his grandfather's words. The old man had carried this grief for decades, unable to share it, but unwilling to let go of the memory of his lost son. The Camaro wasn't just a car, it was a monument to love, loss, and the hope that somehow, someday the pain would transform into something meaningful. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was his Aunt Carol. "Jake, you've been there all morning. Everything okay?" "Yeah, Aunt Carol, just going through a lot of stuff." "Hey, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did Grandpa ever mention being married before Grandma Mary?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why would you ask that?" "I found some old documents. It looks like he might have been married to someone named Helen." Another pause, longer this time. "Jake, honey, where are you finding these things?" "In his desk." "Aunt Carol, did you know about this?" Carol sighed heavily. "I was hoping he'd destroyed all that stuff. Yes, I knew about Helen, and I knew about Tommy." Jake's heart raced. "You knew about Tommy? Why didn't anyone ever tell me?" "Because your grandfather made us promise never to mention them. After Tommy died and Helen passed away, Earl just shut down. He couldn't talk about them without falling apart. When he married your grandmother and started over, he said the past was too painful to carry forward. But Tommy was my uncle. Don't you think I had a right to know?" "Oh, sweetie, of course you did. We all thought so. But Earl was so broken by losing them that we didn't want to make it worse. And as the years went by, it just became this thing we didn't talk about." Jake stared at the photograph of Tommy in his military uniform. "There's more, Aunt Carol. A lot more. I think you should come over here." "What do you mean, more?" "I can't explain it over the phone. Can you come to the garage?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes. While he waited for his aunt to arrive, Jake returned to the hidden room and sat in the Camaro, trying to process everything he'd learned. Tommy Morrison had been barely older than Jake was now when he'd made the decision to enlist. He'd owned this beautiful car, had a future in the family business, and had thrown it all away for a sense of duty that ultimately cost him his life. Jake ran his hands over the steering wheel, imagining his uncle doing the same thing 55 years ago. The car felt alive despite decades of storage, as if it were still waiting for Tommy to come home and take it for that promised drive. When Carol arrived, Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She'd known this day would come eventually, the day when Earl's carefully guarded secrets would finally surface. "Show me," she said simply. Jake led her to the workbench and demonstrated how the hidden panel opened. Carol gasped as the Camaro came into view, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Earl kept it all these years." "You knew about the car?" "I helped him put it back there in 1970. Helen had just died, and Earl was, well, he was barely functioning. He said he couldn't stand to look at anything that reminded him of Tommy, but he couldn't bring himself to sell the car either. So we built the false wall and sealed it up." Carol walked around the Camaro slowly, tears streaming down her face. "It looks exactly the same, like time stopped. Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "Earl made me swear on Helen's grave that I'd never mention it. He said if anyone found out about the car, they'd want to know about Tommy, and he couldn't handle telling that story. The pain was too much." Jake showed her the documents he'd found, watching as she nodded at each revelation. "I kept hoping he'd change his mind someday, especially after you started showing interest in cars. But Earl was stubborn. He thought keeping the past buried was the only way to protect everyone from the hurt. But why leave me the clue to find it now?" Carol smiled through her tears. "Because he saw something in you that reminded him of Tommy. The same love for cars, the same mechanical instincts, the same good heart. I think he finally realized that some secrets do more harm than good when you take them to the grave. As they stood together in the hidden room, surrounded by decades of preserved memory, Jake felt a profound sense of connection to the uncle he'd never known. Tommy Morrison had loved this car, had worked in this garage, and had made the ultimate sacrifice for his beliefs. Now, somehow, that legacy had passed to Jake. "What happens now?" Carol asked. Jake looked at the Camaro, then at his aunt, and finally at the photograph of Tommy he still held in his hand. "Now I think it's time to bring Uncle Tommy home." Chapter 3. Bringing Tommy home. The decision to restore the Camaro and honor Tommy's memory wasn't one Jake made lightly. Over the next few days, he found himself returning to the garage repeatedly, sitting in the driver's seat and trying to understand what his grandfather had wanted him to do with this incredible gift. The car itself was in remarkable condition. The dry storage and his grandfather's meticulous care had preserved it beautifully. But as Jake began a thorough inspection, he realized that Earl Morrison had done more than just hide the Camaro. He'd maintained it secretly for 5 decades. Fresh oil in the engine, new spark plugs dated from just 6 months ago, a battery that showed signs of recent replacement. His grandfather had been preparing the car for something, even as his health declined. Jake found maintenance logs hidden in the glove compartment, written in Earl's careful handwriting and documenting decades of preservation work. March 1985, changed oil, checked tire pressure. Still waiting. September 1993, replaced battery, tested electrical systems. Jake asked about the noise from the back room today, told him it was the water heater. December 2018, replaced fuel lines, cleaned carburetor. Getting old, but the car isn't. Maybe soon. The final entry was dated just 2 months before Earl's death, August 2024, final check. Everything ready. Jake will understand what to do. Carol had been visiting daily, helping Jake sort through the emotional weight of their discovery. She brought photo albums Jake had never seen, filled with pictures of Tommy and Helen and stories about the brother Jake had never known existed. "Tommy was going to be a mechanic, like your grandfather," Carol explained as they looked through the photos. "He had an intuitive understanding of engines that Earl said was almost supernatural. When he bought that Camaro, it was already a fast car, but Tommy modified it to be even more powerful." She pointed to a photo showing Tommy bent over the engine bay, his hands dirty with grease and a look of intense concentration on his face. "Earl used to say Tommy could diagnose a problem just by listening to an engine run. You have that same gift, Jake." Jake studied his uncle's face in the photograph. The resemblance was uncanny. Not just physical, but something in Tommy's expression reminded Jake of his own relationship with cars. There was a reverence there, a respect for the mechanical artistry that went beyond mere hobby or profession. "What was he like as a person?" Jake asked. Carol smiled, her eyes growing distant with memory. "Tommy was complicated. Brilliant with cars, but restless about everything else. He felt things deeply, maybe too deeply. When the war started escalating, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd watch the news every night, getting more and more agitated about what was happening." She showed Jake a letter Tommy had written to his girlfriend Linda, explaining his decision to enlist. "I can't stay here pretending everything's normal while other guys are dying overseas. Dad thinks I'm throwing my life away, but I think I'd be throwing it away if I stayed. Some things are more important than being safe." "Linda married someone else while Tommy was at basic training," Carol added quietly. "Broke his heart, but he never showed it. Just threw himself into his military training the same way he'd always thrown himself into everything else." As Jake learned more about Tommy, he began to understand why his grandfather had found it so difficult to let go. Tommy hadn't been just a son. He'd been Earl's partner in the garage, his heir apparent, and his pride and joy. Losing him had torn a hole in Earl's life that never fully healed, But Jake also began to see something else in his grandfather's actions. The careful maintenance of the Camaro, the preservation of Tommy's memory, the decision to finally reveal the secret. It all pointed to a man who'd spent decades processing his grief and had finally found a way to transform it into something positive. The breakthrough came when Jake decided to try starting the Camaro. He'd been hesitant, worried that the engine might have problems after so many years of storage, but as he turned the key, the big block V8 roared to life immediately, settling into a smooth, powerful idle that made the whole garage vibrate. The sound was intoxicating, deep, throaty, and alive with potential. Jake could feel the car's power even at idle, could sense the barely restrained energy that Tommy had built into this machine. But more than that, he could feel a connection to his uncle, as if Tommy's spirit somehow lived on in the rumble of the engine. Carol gasped when she heard the Camaro start. Oh my God, that sound. It's exactly the same as when Tommy used to fire it up on Saturday mornings. Earl would complain about the noise, but you could see he was proud of what Tommy had built. Jake let the engine warm up, then carefully backed the Camaro out of its hiding place for the first time in over 50 years. The garage doors were wide enough, barely, and Jake held his breath as he navigated the car into the afternoon sunlight. The effect was transformative. Under the bright October sky, the hugger orange paint seemed to glow with an inner fire. The chrome bumpers gleamed like mirrors, and the black racing stripes gave the car an aggressive, purposeful look that drew attention from everyone on the street. Within minutes, neighbors began gathering. Detroit had always been a car town, and classic muscle cars commanded immediate respect. An elderly man named Frank, who lived across the street, approached with obvious appreciation. "Jesus Christ, is that a '69 SS?" he asked, circling the car slowly. "This thing is immaculate. Where'd you find it?" "It belonged to my uncle," Jake replied, surprised by how natural the words felt. He died in Vietnam before he could drive it much." Frank's expression grew solemn. "Vietnam, huh? A lot of good boys didn't come back from that one. Your uncle had good taste in cars, I'll give him that. This is a real SS, not one of those fake ones you see at car shows." As more people gathered to admire the Camaro, Jake found himself telling Tommy's story over and over. Each retelling made it feel more real, more personal. Tommy Morrison wasn't just a name in old documents anymore. He was Jake's uncle, a young man who'd loved cars and died for his country, leaving behind a mechanical masterpiece that had waited half a century for someone to appreciate it. That evening, Jake called Carol with a proposal. "I want to take the car to the Veterans Day ceremony next month. I think Tommy deserves to be remembered publicly." "Oh, Jake," Carol said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's beautiful. Earl would love that. He always felt guilty about not honoring Tommy's service more openly. Will you help me research his military record? I want to make sure I get the details right." "Of course. I still have contacts at the VA from when I worked there. We can probably get his full service record." Over the next 2 weeks, Jake and Carol assembled a complete picture of Tommy's military service. Private Thomas Earl Morrison had served with distinction in the 25th Infantry Division, participating in several major operations in South Vietnam. His unit had been engaged in heavy fighting near the Cambodian border when Tommy was killed in action on December 13, 1969. The circumstances of his death were heroic. He'd volunteered to help evacuate wounded soldiers from a position under heavy fire and had been killed by enemy mortar fire while carrying a wounded comrade to safety. He'd been posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for valor, a medal that Earl had kept locked away with the rest of Tommy's memory. As Veterans Day approached, Jake spent his evenings working on the Camaro, not because it needed repair, but because he wanted to understand every system Tommy had built or modified. The car was a testament to his uncle's skill. The engine had been carefully tuned for maximum performance, the suspension had been upgraded for better handling, and countless small details showed Tommy's attention to perfection. Jake found himself talking to Tommy as he worked, sharing his thoughts about the car and asking questions that would never be answered. "Why did you choose this particular carburetor setup?" he'd wonder aloud. Or, "How did you get the exhaust to sound so perfect?" Sometimes, Jake felt like he could almost hear Tommy's voice in the garage's echoes, sharing mechanical wisdom across the decades. It was an odd sensation, but not an unwelcome one. For the first time in his life, Jake felt truly connected to his family's automotive heritage. The night before Veterans Day, Jake sat in the Camaro in the garage, engine running, imagining what it would have been like to meet his uncle. Tommy would have been in his 70s now if he'd lived. Maybe running the garage himself, maybe teaching Jake the tricks he'd never learned from their grandfather. But Jake realized that in a way, Tommy was teaching him. Every time Jake worked on the car, every time he discovered another example of Tommy's craftsmanship, he was learning from his uncle's legacy. The Camaro wasn't just a car. It was a textbook written in steel and chrome. A masterclass in automotive passion taught by a master who died before he could pass on his knowledge in person. Tomorrow, Jake would drive Tommy's Camaro to the Veterans Day ceremony, and for the first time in over 50 years, Thomas Earl Morrison would receive public recognition for his service and sacrifice. But more than that, his story would finally be told. His memory would be honored, and his beautiful car would roar back to life on the streets where it belonged. Jake turned off the engine and sat in the sudden quiet, feeling the presence of 3 generations of Morrison men around him. His grandfather Earl, who'd carried the pain of Tommy's loss for decades. His uncle Tommy, who'd died too young but left behind something beautiful and lasting. And Jake himself, the bridge between past and future, the one chosen to bring Tommy's story full circle. Chapter 4. The Road Home. Veterans Day dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sunshine that made Detroit's weathered buildings look almost golden. Jake had arrived at the garage before sunrise, wanting to spend some quiet time with the Camaro before the ceremony. As he polished the already pristine chrome and checked the engine one final time, he felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Carol arrived at 8 o'clock, carrying a garment bag and a small American flag. "I brought Tommy's uniform," she said quietly. "I thought we could display it next to the car." The uniform was perfectly preserved, still bearing the insignia of the 25th Infantry Division and the bronze star that Tommy had never lived to receive in person. Carol had also brought a display board with photographs and documents chronicling Tommy's life and service. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, studying Jake's face. "I think so. It feels right, you know. Like this is what Grandpa wanted all along, but he just couldn't bring himself to do it." The Veterans Day ceremony was being held at Hart Plaza, with vintage military vehicles and a memorial service for fallen soldiers. Jake had contacted the organizers the week before, explaining Tommy's story and asking if he could participate with the Camaro. They'd been immediately enthusiastic, recognizing both the historical significance of the car and the power of Tommy's narrative. As Jake drove the Camaro through Detroit's morning traffic, he was amazed by the reactions it provoked. Other drivers rolled down their windows to get a better look, pedestrians stopped to stare, and at every red light, someone would approach to ask about the car. The Camaro commanded attention in a way that few modern vehicles could match. But more than the car's beauty, Jake found himself moved by how people responded to Tommy's story. When he mentioned that the car had belonged to his uncle who died in Vietnam, expressions would change from admiration to respect. Tommy's sacrifice meant something to people, even strangers who'd never heard his name. At Hart Plaza, Jake parked the Camaro in the designated area for historic vehicles. The contrast was striking. Most of the other cars were restored military vehicles, jeeps and trucks painted in olive drab. The bright orange Camaro stood out like a flame, representing the civilian dreams that so many young men had left behind when they went to war. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around the car and Tommy's display. Veterans, many of them Tommy's age if he'd lived, shared their own stories of friends who hadn't come home. Families of fallen soldiers connected with Tommy's narrative, understanding the particular pain of lives cut short and dreams deferred. An elderly man named Walter, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, spent a long time studying Tommy's photograph. "I was with the 25th Infantry too," he told Jake quietly. "Different company, but I remember that operation where your uncle died. Bad business. A lot of good boys didn't make it out of that one." Walter's eyes grew distant as he continued. "I came home and bought a Mustang. Thought I was hot stuff. But I always wondered about the guys who didn't get the chance. Your uncle's car here. It's like a monument to all of them, you know. All the drives they never took, all the Saturday nights they never had." As the morning progressed, Jake found himself becoming the unofficial keeper of Tommy's story, sharing details about his uncle's life and the car's hidden history with anyone who asked. Each conversation felt like another step in bringing Tommy back to life, making him real for people who'd never known he existed. The ceremony's highlight came when the organizers asked Jake to drive the Camaro in the memorial parade. As he sat behind the wheel, engine idling with that distinctive rumble, Jake felt the weight of responsibility. He wasn't just driving a car, he was carrying Tommy's memory, his grandfather's love, and his family's long-buried grief into the light. The parade route took them through downtown Detroit, past the Renaissance Center and along the riverfront. Thousands of people lined the streets, and the Camaro drew cheers and applause everywhere it went. Jake waved from the driver's seat, but in his mind he imagined Tommy there beside him, finally getting the homecoming he'd never received. At one point, the parade stopped in front of a group of Gold Star families, mothers and fathers who'd lost children in various conflicts. Jake saw tears on many faces as they read the sign on the Camaro, identifying it as Tommy Morrison's car, killed in action in Vietnam, 1969. A woman approached the passenger window and placed her hand on the glass. "Thank you for remembering," she said simply. "My boy died in Iraq. Sometimes I think people forget that they were young once, that they had dreams and cars and girlfriends. Your uncle's story reminds us that they were real people, not just names on a wall." After the ceremony, as Jake was preparing to drive home, Carol approached with tears in her eyes. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said. "He carried Tommy's memory alone for so long. Today you shared it with the world." "It felt right," Jake replied. "Like this is what the car was waiting for, not just to be driven, but to tell Tommy's story." As they prepared to leave Hart Plaza, a young reporter from the Detroit Free Press approached. She'd been covering the Veterans Day ceremony and had become fascinated by Tommy's story and the hidden Camaro. "Would you be willing to let me write about this?" she asked. "I think people would love to hear about how you discovered your uncle's car and decided to honor his memory." Jake hesitated, thinking about his grandfather's desire for privacy, but then he looked at the Camaro, gleaming in the afternoon sun, and realized that some stories were too important to keep hidden. "Yes," he said. "I think Tommy would want people to know." The drive home was different from the morning's journey. The Camaro felt more familiar now, as if Jake and the car had finally accepted each other. The engine's rhythm seemed smoother, the steering more responsive. Jake found himself taking the long way back to the garage, unwilling to end what felt like a sacred journey. As they drove through Detroit's neighborhoods, Jake pointed out landmarks to the empty passenger seat, talking to Tommy as if he were there. "That's where Grandpa used to take me for ice cream," he said. "Or see that building? That's where you and Dad would have gone to high school if things had been different." It was a one-sided conversation, but somehow Jake felt like Tommy was listening, finally getting the tour of his hometown that he'd missed for the past 55 years. Back at the garage, Jake parked the Camaro in its usual spot and sat quietly for a moment, processing the day's events. The car had performed flawlessly, drawing crowds and starting conversations wherever they went. But more than that, it had served as a bridge between past and present, allowing Tommy's story to be told and his sacrifice to be recognized. Carol joined him in the garage, both of them looking at the Camaro with new appreciation. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake had been thinking about that question all day. The car was legally his, worth a considerable amount of money that could help with his student loans and living expenses. But selling it felt like betraying everything his grandfather and uncle had invested in the machine. "I'm going to keep it," he said finally. "But not hidden. Tommy's story deserves to be told, and this car is the best way to tell it." Over the next few weeks, Jake began making regular appearances at car shows and veteran events throughout Michigan. The story of Tommy's Camaro spread through social media and local news, touching people who understood the power of family legacy and sacrifice. The Detroit Free Press article, when it appeared, was picked up by national outlets. Soon, Jake was receiving emails and letters from people across the country who'd been moved by Tommy's story. Some were veterans who'd served in Vietnam, others were families who'd lost loved ones in various conflicts, and many were simply car enthusiasts who appreciated the intersection of automotive passion and personal history. One letter particularly moved Jake. It came from Linda Patterson, now Linda Sullivan, who identified herself as Tommy's former girlfriend. She was in her 70s now, living in Florida, but she remembered Tommy clearly. "Dear Jake, I saw the article about Tommy's car and had to write. I was Linda Kowalski back then, and Tommy and I dated for almost 2 years before he enlisted. I've thought about him often over the decades, wondering what kind of man he would have become. I want you to know that Tommy was special. He had this intensity about everything he cared about: cars, his family, his beliefs about right and wrong. When he decided to enlist, it broke my heart, but I understood it. He couldn't live with himself if he didn't act on his convictions. I married someone else while Tommy was at basic training, and I've always felt guilty about that. But I was young and scared, and I didn't know how to handle loving someone who might not come home. Your grandfather probably never forgave me for hurting Tommy, and I don't blame him. Seeing that beautiful car again, reading about how your grandfather preserved it all these years, it makes me believe that love really does last forever. Tommy may have died young, but he left something beautiful behind, and now you're sharing that beauty with the world. Thank you for honoring his memory. He would be so proud. Sincerely, Linda Sullivan." Jake shared the letter with Carol, both of them moved by this voice from Tommy's past. It added another layer to their understanding of who Tommy had been, not just a soldier or a car enthusiast, but a young man who'd loved and been loved, who'd made difficult choices and lived with their consequences. As winter approached, Jake made a decision that would have surprised his grandfather. He enrolled in automotive technology classes at a local community college, inspired by Tommy's mechanical genius and wanting to understand cars at the same deep level his uncle had achieved. The Camaro became his practice vehicle, though it needed little work. Instead, Jake focused on learning to tune and modify engines, using Tommy's car as a reference point for perfection. He found old hot rod magazines from the late 1960s, studying the techniques Tommy would have used to build such a powerful, reliable machine. More importantly, Jake began documenting everything he learned about the car and Tommy's story. He created a detailed photo journal, recording every modification, every part number, every technique that made the Camaro special. It was his way of preserving not just the car, but the knowledge and passion that had created it. On the anniversary of Tommy's death, December 13th, Jake drove the Camaro to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. He found Tommy's name on the black granite wall, running his fingers over the carved letters that represented his uncle's brief but meaningful life. Standing there in the December cold, Jake felt the full weight of his inheritance. The Camaro wasn't just a car, it was a responsibility, a trust that had been passed down through 3 generations of Morrison men. His grandfather had preserved it out of love and grief. Tommy had built it out of passion and skill. Now it was Jake's turn to carry that legacy forward. As he drove home through the winter darkness, the Camaro's headlights cutting through the night, Jake understood what his grandfather had really left him. It wasn't just a valuable car or even a family mystery finally solved. It was the understanding that some things, love, memory, craftsmanship, sacrifice, are too important to be hidden away. Tommy Morrison had died at 22, but his spirit lived on, in the rumble of a perfectly tuned engine, in the gleam of chrome that had waited 50 years to shine again, and in the story that connected past to present in ways that transcended time. The Camaro was home now, not hidden behind false walls, but out in the world where it belonged, telling Tommy's story to anyone willing to listen. And Jake, the nephew who'd never known his uncle existed, had become the keeper of that story, ensuring that Tommy Morrison's brief, bright life would never be forgotten again. As Jake pulled into the garage that night, he realized his grandfather had been right about one thing. The car had been waiting, not for Tommy to return from a war that claimed too many young lives, but for someone who could understand its true value and share its story with the world. The 1969 Camaro SS was finally home, and so was the memory of the young man who'd built it, loved it, and left it behind as his lasting gift to a family he'd never had the chance to know. The end. Thanks for watching. Some cars come back to life, others bring someone back with them. See you in the next story, right here on Rust and Memory.